So today's video might be a bit controversial. We are talking about live feeder fish and whether or not you should be giving these to your fish or your cichlids. We're going to walk through some pros and cons of using feeder fish, and I'm totally expecting to get some negative comments, so let's go ahead and dive right in. So usually when we're talking about feeder fish, we are talking about those big overstocked tanks maybe at your local fish store or a big box store of goldfish or minnows, and so there's just tons of them in there. They're usually pretty cheap and sold with the purpose of people bringing them home to their own aquariums to feed the bigger fish, to maybe simulate that hunting behavior. Maybe they think it's cool, or maybe they think it's giving nutritional value to their fish. And we're gonna break some of those points down along with some primary cons, and I'm gonna give our own firm opinion about whether or not you should be using live feeder fish. We get questions about this all the time, so we definitely needed to make this video just for educational purposes or just to break down whether or not you should be doing it yourself. I've been on YouTube about 7 years and I've developed some pretty thick skin when it comes to negative comments, but still go easy on me.
Here we go.
Because when it comes to live feeder fish, I absolutely discourage the practice. There are pros and cons on both sides of this, but we're going to start with the cons because they are so clear to me that I think they would dissuade you right away. But we're also going to talk about some of the pros and why a few people might elect to go this route. So we're going to go ahead and start with the main con here, which is that you are likely going to transfer diseases from the feeder fish to your fish at home. If you look at some of those big overstocked tanks, some of those goldfish or minnows, they usually look emaciated. There are likely many of them dead in the tank. And if you just look at those tanks with fish carrying diseases, likely about to die or on the verge of death, I can't imagine wanting to give one of those to one of my fish, to my Oscar or my Stingray or any of my fish down here, and potentially giving diseases to them. You can almost always expect that those feeder fish carry some type of illness or disease, and if your fish at home are eating them, they are likely going to get that same disease. And you can do things like taking a bunch of feeder fish and quarantining them at home, which is a good step to take. However, you are setting up another aquarium, you're adding to your expense, your convenience, and all the other things that come with having a separate tank just for quarantining feeder fish. And I bring this up first because this is the most common type of live feeder fish that we see in the hobby today. This is what people normally go to the store and pick up. And in my opinion, it's almost always a bad idea to do this. Even if you're going through the quarantine process, you may not even kill off the disease that these things get, and a lot of them will likely die in your quarantine tank, again adding to your expense. And there are some live feeder fish options that are way less risky than buying from one of these overstocked disease-ridden tanks, and we'll touch on that later in the video. But we're going to go ahead and go into number 2. The second con on the list is the nutritional value. Some people had the mistaken opinion that live feeder fish will give more nutritional value to your fish at home. It's just simply not true. Especially if you look at the development of food today, there's been decades of progress. Even the dry foods now have really great ingredients with protein and way less processed fish meal and things like that. And you can give your fish a really great varied diet with plenty of dry food options out there on the market. But obviously the best alternative is frozen foods. You could just buy a big bag of raw shrimp from your grocery store, and that will last you for months, and it is just as high or higher quality when it comes to nutrition and feeding your fish. You could also do things like brine shrimp, tilapia, bloodworms, clams, mussels. There are plenty of different options that you can go for, and none of these frozen food options will carry the risk, expense, convenience, or carry some of those diseases that the live feeder fish likely will. If you just Google live feeder fish online, you'll see a mixed bag when it comes to nutritional value. Some people will think, hey, that goldfish has great value for my fish. Other people will say it's pretty high in fat and it likely does not have plenty of the other nutrients that dry or frozen foods will come with. But just in general, I would say your dry and frozen food options are way better for your varied diet and all the different nutrients that your fish will need long term to be happy and healthy. And then another con of live feeder fish, which again might be controversial, is the expense. I would say that live feeder fish are no longer a cheaper option to feed your fish. If you look at big box stores especially, the prices have only increased for these fish. and you're likely going to have some dead-on arrivals when you bring them home. If you put them in a tank to quarantine like you should be, you are likely going to lose at least half of those because they're so disease-ridden in the first place. And you can buy dry or frozen foods in big quantities, maybe in bulk now, and they are going to be way more cost-effective. For instance, if you're buying a big bag of raw shrimp or frozen tilapia patties, those will be way less expensive than if you're buying the equivalent of feeder fish, especially when those feeder fish die in your tanks and you're just gonna have to buy more. And it's just an ongoing process, and that's not even counting what would happen if you give those feeder fish to your fish at home and then they get sick, and then you're treating them with medications, which are the most expensive out of anything in this process. So if you're not thinking about the potential ramifications when it comes to cost, just take a second and think about it.
Saying is think about it, okay? Think about it!
And the last part when it comes to affordability is if you are buying that quarantine tank like you should if you're using live feeder fish, that's another tank you're buying, another filter, maybe a light. All those things add up and add into the cost of the feeder fish themselves. Our fourth con on the list is convenience. Because with live feeder fish, you are likely going to your fish store, big box store, very frequent to constantly be buying these feeder fish. You may not have the best stocking in your fish store. You may have to go back a few times. And when it comes to dry or frozen food, like I said, you can buy in bulk and have them for months on end and never have to go anywhere, order anything online. You can just always have it at your home. You also have the convenience of not needing another tank dedicated to these live feeder fish. You don't need extra space in your house. You won't be doing water changes or filter maintenance on another tank just for your quarantine tank with the feeder fish. Also, you have to be super careful not to contaminate your other tanks with the water from your quarantine tank. So it's just another area where you might be introducing issues to your other tanks if you have a quarantine tank with known issues with fish that are likely disease-ridden. And the fifth con on the list, and don't worry, this is not the last con, we are still going here, is that your fish could get injured whenever you're feeding live fish. When you dump those fish in the tank, those predatory fish or your big cichlids dart around the tank. They could be banging into decor, the glass, just a big burst of energy going after those fish, and it could also lead to stress if they can't catch those fish. Maybe you put in some fast little goldfish or minnows, maybe you put in some convict cichlids, some babies that you raised, and they just can't catch those fish. It's just adding to their overall stress, and the injury option as well. It's just a mixed bag of bad things that could be happening to your fish when you're dumping in those live feeders. And before we get into the pros, the last con on the list, con number 6, is that it can be cruel. And I am a fish keeper. In all my fish room, I am just constantly trying to keep fish alive. I'm trying to keep cichlids from fighting each other. I'm treating diseases and illness. The last thing I'm looking to do is raise up fish or buy feeders and give them to my other bigger fish as food. It's just not something I'm into. I don't find that cool. And I know some of you might, and some of you might label me as soft or whatever. I don't really care. I have gotten this type of comment too, where fish in the wild are eating other fish, and that's absolutely true. But there's nothing really natural about a glass box full of water. This is an aquarium. It's not natural in the first place. And because you have them in the aquarium, you have better options. They will go after frozen foods just as hard. They will be showing off that predatory behavior when they are going after that raw piece of shrimp just as much as if they're hunting down a sick goldfish. So yes, this last con that we mentioned is subjective. It is just my opinion. You may not feel the same, but the first 5 cons we've walked through are absolutely true. And if that doesn't persuade you from not using live feeder fish, I hope you just think about it a little harder. But we're still going to go into the pros, just one more consideration of how you could potentially use live feeder fish in a more practical way with less risk to your current fish. And this point here is more just a consideration. It's not really a pro or a con, but if you're absolutely going to use live feeder fish, I would recommend a quarantine tank, or if you're growing up your own babies, that is a way safer route of feeding live fish to your bigger fish. And it happens in some fish rooms. Maybe you have a pair of convict cichlids that are breeding like crazy, and you have no fish store that will take those babies off your hands. What do you do with them? Some people will throw those convicts into a tank and use them as feeders. The same thing can be used for guppies or any other fish that breed like crazy and you just have nowhere else to put them. In that case, I am almost okay with it, but I would still recommend separating the male and female so that they are not breeding like crazy anymore. It's way easier to just take one of those convict cichlids, separate the pair, put them in a different tank, or move one of those fish to a friend or a local fish store. They are way more likely to take on that one fish than hundreds and hundreds of convict babies or guppies, and in that case you still don't have to use them as feeders. Also, if you are going this route, you are still putting time, resources, and money into raising those fish, and then you get into the cruelty aspect again, where what are you doing? You're raising these guys up just for slaughter?
Kept him alive so that he can die at the proper moment. You've been raising him like a pig for slaughter.
But if you haven't noticed by now, I have a pretty strong opinion against live feeder fish. But because this is a fully rounded video on the topic, we're going to go into the pros of this next. The first pro that many people will say is that it produces a natural behavior, a natural hunting behavior in your fish that you may not normally see. And although this can be true, I've already kind of touched on it, they will still go after a lot of your frozen and dry foods just as much, but some people really like to see those natural behaviors. I do have some fish like my geophagus that I absolutely love seeing their sand sifting behavior, or my shell dwellers, seeing them dig into the sand and make homes out of those shells. It is awesome to see those natural behaviors. And some people will argue that live feeder fish produces that out of their big cichlids, and sometimes that might be the case. And if you're absolutely into live feeder fish, maybe this is your one argument against me, but I will come back and say the frozen food option will still elicit that awesome hunting response that you might get from your bigger cichlids or monster fish. And the second pro on the list is a bit debatable. It is the affordability. I already talked about why that could be a con if you have some of those other expenses mixed in, but if you do have the right fish store near you that are selling them really cheaply, and you're not having a bunch of losses when you bring those feeder fish home, there is a potential you're saving a bit of money. But I would argue that some of the dry and frozen food options that you could buy in bulk are still going to be cheaper, so I'm just adding it to the pros list because I could be proven wrong in a specific area depending on your fish store. But if you start adding the quarantine tank and everything else that you should be, this pro on the list is kind of removed. And then the third pro of feeding live fish is for those fish keepers that say that their fish at home won't eat anything else. Maybe they're totally stuck on live food, maybe they're wild caught, or some peacock bass or piranha or monster fish are totally hooked only on live foods. And I have seen that happen occasionally, but I've never seen the fish keeper not be able to wean them off of live foods. Because I can guarantee if you have that peacock bass that only eats live food, if he doesn't eat for a couple days, that piece of raw shrimp you put in the tank will start to look really appetizing, and before long, I guarantee he will start to eat that frozen food, and if not, why are you keeping him in the first place? And as far as I can see, those are the only real pros of feeding live fish, and I've kept big fish. I mean, I have a big stingray right here, and I have a big Oscar, and we've kept other big predatory type fish in the past, and we've never had issues feeding dry or frozen foods. And I think that goes to show that the cons on the list definitely outweigh the pros. And if you do feed live feeder fish, I am not saying you're a bad person, and there are many ways to do this hobby. I just feel very strongly that there are better alternatives than feeding live feeder fish, and I would just hope that you take in consideration all the things I mentioned on the cons list, and especially if you're going to do feeder fish, that you do it in the right way. So that covers whether or not you should be using feeder fish in your own aquariums. Of course, you can make your own choices. I've made mine, but hopefully you at least respected the information I gave today and can make an informed decision moving forward. But thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time.